Hi, my name's Jordan Marshall. I am Special Projects Editor at Building Magazine, and I'm really grateful to be hosting this session today, the final session of our Net Zero Live conference. It's another great one, and which is saying something because we've had two really wonderful sessions already today. And so this one is all about what the UK infrastructure needs to do to support net zero goals. I'm really pleased to be able to welcome our panel today. They've all got some great insights. Can't wait to hear from them and also get them to field your questions. So we've got Ian Allard, who's an Associate Director in Responsible Business Practice at MACE, Dr. Tom Dolan, who's a Senior Research Fellow at UCRIC and Postgraduate Research Fellow at CDICE, and Maria Manidaki, Net Zero Technical Lead at Mott MacDonald. So a huge welcome to you all and thank you. Before I hand over to the guys who will take you through some presentations to start things off, just a little bit of housekeeping from my end. We'd love you to join in the conversation via social media channels. If you could use the hashtag NZL2022, we'd love to get you involved. Also, please feel free to send through your questions at any time, and we'll try and make sure we get as many of those answered for you as possible in the Q&A portion of today's session. Also, just from a housekeeping point of view, it would be great if everyone could remember this session will be recorded. So if there is anything that you want to check afterwards, just use the same link that you used to join now to check that up. Also, if you want to share it with a colleague or someone else who you think would enjoy it, it will still be free, available on demand via that same link. So please feel free to share. That's probably enough for me to start things off. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Tom Dolan, who's going to start things off for us.
Thank you, Jordan. So yeah, as mentioned, I'm Dr. Tom Dolan. So I work on UCRIC, which is the hat I've got on today, and we're infrastructure research across 15 UK universities. And the bit that I'm working on is around the societal benefits that come from infrastructure as a sustainable, enhancing, net zero, resilient system, fit for purpose governance. And so what I'm going to talk about today is make a few assertions and then suggest a few things that the infrastructure sector can do. So all aspects of modern life are infrastructure enabled. The infrastructure sector simultaneously enables societally beneficial outcomes, but it also determines the level of largely shapes the level of greenhouse gas emissions produced by the societies it enables, whether that be directly or indirectly. And it has a similar impact on the level of air, water, noise, pollution, solid and sewage waste produced. Similarly, it has an impact on the impacts of extreme events. So its resilience buffers the societies it enables against the impacts of extreme events. And since we're talking about net zero, I'm obviously talking about global warming as the main category of extreme events here. But the emissions it produces and its impact on resilience are largely unintentional emergent properties. Historically, we've treated these, we've either ignored them or we've tolerated them, we've regarded them as acceptable externalities. And as a consequence, our societies, our economies, our lifestyles, the whole infrastructure system that enables them has emerged to reflect this context of indifference, really, and acceptance of greenhouse gas emissions and other polluting emissions. So along comes the climate emergency, which we've known about for some time, but I feel the declaration of climate emergencies and the setting of net zero targets are something of a paradigm shift. So we were in a pre-net zero paradigm where we'd kind of normalized greenhouse gas emissions as acceptable externalities, and the whole system had come to reflect that. Can you see my whole screen, or is there go to webinar things in the way?
No, we can see.
I'm assuming you can see.
Slides.
Cool. I'm assuming you can see the whole slide. Sorry. So yes, we've got we've got the paradigm at the top, and then we've got the infrastructure system and the goals of the system, which kind of shape the rules of the system, which then kind of shape the structures and processes that emerge. So, and we've settled into this system, this position, the current system, in which we accept greenhouse gas emissions as externalities and other pollutants as externalities. But as a paradigm shift, greenhouse gas emissions have moved from these acceptable externalities to unacceptable outcomes, and action to avoid, reduce, and mitigate and sequester them has gone from a low priority, a low value action, to a primary objective, or at least it should. I think that's the intention of the target. And this really influences the type and quality of outcomes we expect our infrastructure systems and the infrastructure sector to enable. It really affects the purpose of the governance structures we put in place, and should filter through into how we govern, how we regulate, how we manage, how we plan, how we design, how we procure, how we construct, fund, finance, own, operate, maintain, account for the value of, incentivize investments, measure the performance of, and assess our need for infrastructure systems. So it's a small change, but I think it's a paradigm shift, really. And national infrastructure, I would argue, is a leverage point. What happens in national infrastructure, I think, is make or break for our ability to get to net zero. Inaction on infrastructure, I think, makes it not possible. Action in infrastructure gives us a chance, because all organisations' scope 2 emissions using greenhouse gas protocol terms are a result of infrastructure. All individual scope 2 emissions are a result of the same infrastructure. So if we can make a difference in infrastructure, we can catalyse societal progress. So the paradigm has changed, but in this slide, I'm trying to illustrate that the other parts haven't yet followed. So we're not delivering what we need to do. There's misalignment has started to emerge between systems that have evolved over a long time period, accepting greenhouse gas emissions, and now legacy systems are now not fit for purpose in this new context. So this is where we want to get to. We want to get back to a position where everything's aligned with the guiding paradigm. And this will take some effort, and infrastructure systems, infrastructure sector in isolation can't do this by themselves. It will need government, it will need all aspects of society, but there is a lot that infrastructure can do, and this is what I've tried to focus on now. So what the infrastructure sector can do is start to address these misalignments and start to realign the system goals and purpose, system rules and structures and processes with the new attitude towards greenhouse gas emissions, other polluting emissions, and systemic resilience. So I've identified 7 actions. These are quite high level and quite broad brush, but I think the first one is we need visionary climate emergency leadership coming from the infrastructure sector as a whole. We need to acknowledge this point, that it's a globally significant leverage point, and that the value of transformation in infrastructure is a societal one, not captured by the infrastructure itself, but accruing to society. So we need an infrastructure that makes high profile commitments to net zero greenhouse gas emissions targets, that recognises systemic transformation is needed and uses this as an opportunity to enhance its resilience. Another quality that will need systemic transformation of established systems, and also to tackle these other sources of polluting emissions, which are also linked to attitudes toward the kind of historic context. And we also need to explicitly integrate the purpose into all objectives for the infrastructure sector. So if we're looking at a sector that allows sustainable economic growth or net zero economic growth. We're not looking at net zero and economic growth, we're looking at the two coupled. Net zero is a quality that needs to be attached to all outcomes that the infrastructure sector seeks to help. And this visionary leadership could, and I would like it to go beyond net zero, to think about net negative emissions, net sequestration, maybe the concept of net resilience gain, where every action we take within the infrastructure system adds positively to the resilience or has a positive impact on reducing emissions. And I'd even like to see it extended to net zero pollution rather than net zero greenhouse gas emissions, so that we're tackling those other forms of polluting emissions. And then we need to look at the rules. We need to get the rules of the system realigned with the new paradigm and the ambition for net zero. So by rules, I'm talking about governance structures, really. So the sector itself might not be able to influence those too much, but we need to review, realign, update infrastructure governance processes to be consistent with the ambition for net zero and then the new paradigm regarding the acceptability of polluting emissions. And we then need to do similar in terms of system structures and processes. And this is where the sector definitely has more control. So we need all infrastructure sector decision-making processes to be fit for purpose. So I would argue we need to review, update, and realign all management, all planning, all procurement, all operating, maintenance, design, project specification, performance measurement, asset management, site management processes to reflect the new net zero priority. We then need to support that by getting systemic. We need to develop in-depth systemic understanding of all operational procedures, processes, and the interdependencies at the heart of those. And we need to combine that with systemic carbon auditing. This needs to be really comprehensive. We would need to get to a position where we can overlay onto our process mapping, our in-depth understanding of our processes, our emissions, and we need to do this for scope 1, 2, and 3. And this is something I should have mentioned in the visionary leadership section. The targets that the sector sets need to take responsibility for the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions coming from infrastructure, and also need to look at the whole life cycle of infrastructure, so the capital, the operational, and the user emissions. So this will require a lot of collaboration, will require a lot of working with supply chains, but these are the foundations that we need to start to lay before we look too much at the specifics of what the interventions or what the actions are. And collaboration becomes important. The infrastructure sector is traditionally, certainly in the UK, been quite silo specialist. You've got your water, you've got your power, you've got everything else. We need to collaborate within those sectors. We need to collaborate across those sectors, up and down value chains, with users and with other communities of interest. It's a cross-cutting issue. And with that in mind, we also need to then use this systemic perspectives, the carbon auditing, learning from collaboration to develop a portfolio that has many qualities, has to be diverse, has to be long-term focused, and be multifaceted, multi-scale, synergistic in terms of multiple policy agendas, and strive to be focused on systemically targeted interventions that we know can transform the system. And two final things that I didn't get into my slides. We need to think more broadly about the solution space. need to cease to be constrained by incumbent technologies and mindsets, and we need to systemically seek sequestration opportunities. Because the other side of net zero is not just lowering what we produce, but it's also helping to lock away. So my barriers and constraints largely linked to the legacy and business as usual processes that have evolved to be fit for purpose in one context, but in the net zero paradigm context are now obsolete and are potentially barriers to achieving what we want to do, which is the same great societally beneficial outcomes without any of the downsides. And that is my presentation. So I hope that made sense, and happy to field your questions after everybody else has presented.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tom. Really appreciate it. I think that's a great way for us to kick things off. Next, I'm going to ask Maria if she could turn on her camera, and we'll give you presenter access and hear from you. Just a quick reminder to our audience, because we've had this come in a couple of times. Yes, it will be available on demand. You will be able to view it all via the same link again if there's things you want to check. And we also had a request for hashtag again for people wanting to join in. That's hashtag NZL2022. So Maria, I'll hand over to you.
Hi, thank you very much, Jordan. Hi, everyone. I'm Maria Mandaki from Mott MacDonald. Oops, can you see my, yeah? Can you see my screen? I don't know.
Perfect, yeah.
You can see the slides, yeah? Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Maria from Mott MacDonald, and I'm an engineer. I've been working on UK infrastructure, particularly in the water sector and transport for many, many years now. And I have been lucky to be involved in the decarbonisation of the infrastructure sector in the UK for quite a few years now. What I wanted to start with is I wanted to give you a little bit of a high-level view of the progress of decarbonisation in UK infrastructure by looking at this timeline at the bottom. So since the Climate Change Act, many things have happened. I also sit in the Green Construction Board, where we authored the Infrastructure Carbon Review in 2013 that essentially gave some recommendations for the economic infrastructure sectors under leadership, governance, commercial solutions, policy planning, collaboration, standards, baseline, and metrics. And since then, lots of things have happened. The Paris Agreement, the past 2080 carbon management specification for infrastructure that we are currently updating this year, clean growth strategy, and of course, the Net Zero Climate Change Act and 6 carbon budgets. So lots has been happening. However, last year, as part of the Green Construction Board, we did a review of how are we doing 7 years on when it comes to the infrastructure decarbonisation in the UK. And you can find this report online if you Google it. Good progress, but not fast enough. And essentially, the emissions have been reducing in the energy sectors, and especially the energy transition that we have. Lots of investment has been happening, but have been increasing overall in transport, water, waste, and other sectors. Some of the enablers that we looked at in the ICR, and we identified some good progress and pockets of excellence, but also some gaps that I would like to focus on, are mainly around procurement, that there has been very slow progress, that actually asset owners, but also at government level, they didn't always ask the right things when it comes to decarbonization. We're still operating in silos. We have achieved some carbon reductions, but these have been mainly focused on capital carbon, the carbon associated with construction, and not many reductions have been achieved over the whole life, including the user carbon that Tom mentioned. We also saw that there is lack of leadership in the sector, although we have seen great pockets of leadership at board level, but also mostly at practitioner level. There is still a lack of systematic leadership across the organizations and the value chain. And we haven't seen many exemplar decarbonization projects, especially with alignment to net zero. One of the things that we saw that is mainly focused on the buildings space rather than infrastructure is that we haven't really started looking at things for retrofitting. I mean, most of the infrastructure, over 70 or 80% of our infrastructure we'll need in 2050 is already built. So we need to start focusing on those things. And building on Tom's point, one of the areas we looked at from the evidence from looking at different organizations is that we still have an immature systems thinking in the infrastructure space. And this is the link here where you can find the document. Now, how we're trying to address these things. So past 2080, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. We co-authored it between Mott MacDonald and Arup back in 2016, and we're doing an update this year that is going to be out for public consultation by the end of the month and hopefully published by autumn this year. So essentially it's a framework of how to manage systematically whole life carbon in infrastructure. The new update is trying to focus on integrating infrastructure with buildings, so looking at the wider built environment, and touch upon the different points that I mentioned being gaps, like the systems thinking, the net zero agenda, how things have moved on, and how to strengthen collaboration, leadership, etc. One of the things I wanted to show going forward that is very, very important is we keep focusing on the technical solutions, alternative materials, renewable energy, which are, of course, very important. But we've seen that the behaviors are still not there when it comes to the value chain for infrastructure and the wider built environment. So when it comes to decarbonization and the net zero ask, which is hugely challenging, there are things that need to happen at government level in terms of policies and incentives, and how do we drive the right behavior down the value chain. Of course, the government has published, they have first of all a legal obligation. They have published the national net zero strategy. There is the energy strategy. However, there is still lack of clarity of how its infrastructure sector will fit into the national carbon budgets and the decarbonization trajectories. And because we're operating in silos in the UK in infrastructure, there isn't that infrastructure integrator still here. And this could be potentially a role in this space, the bubble of government regulators. Now, when it comes to the asset owners, designer, contractors, product material suppliers, we have strengthened the guidance in past 2080 to see what exactly does this mean to have a new capital program at the asset level, or a project at the network level. How does this align to net zero? Can a project be net zero, or it doesn't make sense to have that definition? What are the alternative materials and technologies that we need to incentivize in our procurement mechanism for the supply chain? For example, we're talking about low carbon concrete in terms of capital carbon and alternatives to steel. We're talking about technologies like, can we plan for a joint infrastructure at the system level when it comes to hydrogen production and use? Can we link the transport, energy, and water sectors? And how do we best integrate nature-based solutions to bring additional co-benefits with climate resilience, biodiversity, net gain, and others? I'm not going to bore you into too much detail on this, but the message here is that in order for the UK infrastructure to really push the boundary for net zero, it's very, very important to have more clarity on the non-technical aspects of the value chain, which is the collaboration, the alignment of objectives, so that everyone can work towards a common goal. This is a draft diagram from the past 2080 update, and you will see it for commentary in the public consultation, which we're hoping you're gonna be feeding into. So basically what we wanted to bring here is building on Tom's point that net zero is a systemic challenge. And when we look at the different levels of infrastructure in the UK or any other country, we're talking about individual assets, can be a pipeline, a rail track, a building. We could have a network, which is a collection of assets, like a portfolio of assets that an asset owner manager is managing. And all these things are fitting into the wider system, which could be a UK infrastructure sector, or the system of systems, which is all infrastructure or the built environment. And the idea here is that different players in the value chain, they've got different levels of control and influence of those emissions. We've seen that many asset owners are trying to set a net zero target at the asset level. For example, I'm building a road. How can I make a net zero road? And we're trying to provide more clarity in past 2080 of trying to look at net zero as a target at the system level, because if you start looking at it at the asset level, you might create unintended consequences by trying to offset lots of those emissions to make it net zero and balance the books. So it's very, very important, even if one is working on an asset level project or program of work, is to understand the implications and opportunities of how this fits to the wider network and system, and whether it's aligned with any targets at that level. Sometimes we recognize that we may need to sacrifice capital carbon, meaning emitting more, in order to save user carbon or operational carbon, irrespective of which sector we're talking about. So the system level concepts and how the value chain players fit and have clarity of those objectives are very key. And I just wanted to wrap up really on giving you some of the priorities that are not only going to be found in the past 28 update, but these are things that we've seen the value chain and infrastructure in the UK have started looking at in more detail. So if we take at the delivery process at the bottom, from strategy to option selection to development, design, construction, operation of assets or networks or systems, of infrastructure, and our ability to influence the whole life carbon reduces over time, we need to make sure we start early in understanding what data we need to make those choices, to compare options. How do we maximize reduction of user carbon? For example, if you take the transport sector, is there anything we can do to take HGVs off the roads that are more difficult to decarbonize, to be electrified basically, and we're relying on hydrogen, and electrify them through a railway system? And this is a systemic problem, and these decisions need to happen at the strategy level. And as we move forward into the delivery process, we need to start then thinking more specific solutions. Can we look at land use changes? What is the impact on the land use changes from an infrastructure project, especially a linear one like a road, a pipeline, or another linear asset? Will it emit more carbon? Will it disturb the land? Or will it sequester more carbon? What is the role of nature-based solutions and natural capital into infrastructure planning? Are the performance of those solutions good enough for us to rely on, for example, to avoid any extreme flood events instead of building new assets? And how we link to climate resilience. And as we move into the detailed design stage, is about selecting the right materials, technologies, etc. And never forget the retrofit, because this is very important to reduce the actual capital carbon of our projects. So some of those priorities, I'm sure most of you will recognize that a lot of the asset owners and their supply chain have driven some significant innovations in many of those, but more needs to be done, because the message is that, it's a good progress, but not good enough. And given that the UK infrastructure accounts is responsible in one way or another for more than half of the UK emissions, it's very, very important to more systematically try to manage those emissions. So this is my very quick overview of the role of UK infrastructure. I wanted to also say it would be great if you in the audience, if you were interested in past 2080, to feed into the consultation process that will start at the end of this month. Thank you. That's it for me.
So much. That's another great presentation. We've already got some questions coming in, but I'm just going to get Ian up to give his presentation first. Please do keep those questions coming through. We will try and get as many of them answered as possible, but get them in early so we can hopefully get them covered off.
Oh, thank you, Maria. Thank you, Jordan. Afternoon, everybody. Let me just share my screen with you. I'm very much going to talk today about a practical, very hands-on approach to, I guess, decarbonisation and delivering net zero in major infrastructure or in large programs in particular. At MACE, in our responsible business team, we're massively focused on the how of decarbonisation, actually practically on a day-to-day basis. How can we make it really simple for everybody from project directors, the supply chain, design team, architects, engineers, to understand what it is we need to do and how we need to get there. So I'm going to use a program management office approach, and I'm also going to use a bit of an example of one of the major infrastructure projects that we're working on. how this has worked and how it works, on the ground on a practical level. So when I'm talking about a program management office approach, MACE has been an engineering and project management led organization, and as part of our responsible business team, we always like to start with why are we decarbonizing? Why do we want to be net zero carbon? What are the drivers? Be it everything from legislative to science-based targets to the government's net zero. Really fundamentally understanding, is and has this been considered as part of the business case? If we need to deliver carbon reduction and massive carbon reduction on infrastructure and major programs, have we considered this in business case? Do we know the cost uplift is going to be? Do we know the return on investment? Do we know the internal rate of return? Why are we doing this, and then what are we doing? We talk a lot about net zero carbon, but really we're talking about carbon reduction. We're talking about embodied carbon reduction. We're talking about massive reductions in energy use intensity. We also can't just solely get focused on carbon. And I'll give a bit of an example of how the agenda is a lot bigger than this. I know the name of this event is net zero carbon and infrastructure, but if we solely talked about just carbon and infrastructure, the easiest solution would be not to have new infrastructure, but that is not the prime reason. And Tom was talking about the social benefits of infrastructure, and it's all driven from infrastructure. And so we need to remember that not solely always to get drawn in on carbon and just carbon. But the big thing I want to talk about in one of the case studies we've got today is the how. There's lots of why out there, there's lots of what's, there's lots of scientific data, drivers, initiatives, but the practical on the ground, day to day, how do you, from the very beginning of an infrastructure or major program project, how do you actually do net zero carbon? How do you actually implement it on the ground and deliver it, at the end? So no need to talk too much a little bit about this, but just flashing up some of the whys. You're probably all very familiar with these. Just to kind of give an example, everything from investors to stakeholders to legislative drivers. I talked about the what as well. It's not just carbon. We're talking about the whole suite of sustainability agenda. We're talking about everything from biodiversity net gain to well-being to social value in the supply chain. You very much need to, on major infrastructure, define what it is you want to achieve by the end. This needs to be all outcome focused. It needs to be by the end of our 7-year program, our 10-year program, what is it we want to achieve by the very end? And that needs to be set right at the beginning. So talking about practical steps, your why, you need to be very clear on why you're doing it. Is it part of your business case? Have you got the return on investment? Do you know the why of why you need to achieve this? And then the what. What topics and what outcomes do you ultimately want to achieve by the end? Obviously, in this session, we're going to focus on carbon reduction, and by the end of a major infrastructure program being net zero carbon or nearly zero carbon in operation and massive reduction in embodied carbon. But I just wanted to just highlight there that don't forget, it's not always just about carbon. So the bit I really wanted to get to was the how. So on a major infrastructure program, how do you actually go about becoming net zero carbon, or how do you go about massively reducing the carbon of your new build infrastructure project? Now, we've talked a lot about the what and the why in the business case. You need to define what it is you're actually looking at, predominantly embodied carbon, predominantly, operational energy use at the end point. But you need to set those what's and those outcomes at the very beginning, and then come up with the plan and the prioritization of activities to deliver that plan, very early on in the process. And then we need to enforce and ensure that during that process, there is an owner, someone for the actual outcome of the vision. So if you've got net zero carbon as an infrastructure target from the beginning, who owns that? Is it the program management office? Is it the project managers? Is it the engineers? Is it the architect? Is it you as the client? If you're a client organization, who is the owner of the vision to be ultimately net zero carbon? Are you or that person, are you driving net zero carbon throughout the entire process, both through design, both through delivery, and with all the variety of stakeholders that involves? So I wanted to talk this through with one of the infrastructure clients that MACE are currently working with and partnering with And that is Asavia, the Iceland Keflavik International Airport. And they have a vision, a big strategic why piece, why they want to be a net zero carbon airport from the infrastructure and the airport operator perspective. You know, they want to drive massive carbon reduction across their built environment and their infrastructure, so that they can also walk the walk in terms of asking the airlines to drive carbon reduction, to come up with innovative solutions. They want to set the example across these areas in terms of, you know, bringing the outside in, passenger well-being, you know, massive carbon reduction of their buildings, and both on embodied carbon and an operational energy front, or operational energy use intensity front. And so they've got a huge why strategic piece around why they want to do this and to become a responsible aviation hub and an example in the aviation industry. When it's come to the what, there is a strong Asavia corporate policy on sustainability. So you'll find this across lots of organizations in infrastructure where there is a strong corporate policy, and perhaps maybe that corporate policy isn't translated or isn't easily translatable into new build programs and capital delivery. So one of the key roles that we've had as MACE is translating that corporate policy into a number of capital delivery targets, capital delivery objectives, so that every single person involved in the program, in the infrastructure program, knows what the outcomes of that program need to be after 10 years. So we've translated their corporate policy, their day-to-day operations, into the capital delivery and the infrastructure part of their business. And this is what it looks like on the major development program. So their vision, their why is to be a responsible aviation hub. Their what is a net zero carbon major development program. It's no net loss of biodiversity across the program. And it's responsible resource consumption, with a number of objectives and targets around wastewater, materials. And on a social value front, you know, not forgetting the wider piece, you know, they want to deliver future talent, be a good neighbour, and enable local businesses in terms of procurement, skills, employment. So that's the why and the what. If we take the how, so very much again focusing back on carbon, because this session is all about how we drive carbon reduction or net zero carbon and infrastructure. They looked at their day-to-day operations and kind of have a average impact on a yearly basis of about 3,000 tons of carbon from their operational scope 1 and 2 emissions. Their scope 3 from the major development program is going to be roughly tenfold of that, so around 300,000 tons. And their upstream influence around airlines and vehicle hire is around 3 million tons. So we very much painted the picture for them around understanding their impact, their control, what they can control, what they can't control, and understanding their up and downstream impact from both scope 1, 2, 3, and then their upstream influence of partners who use their infrastructure. And we've set targets around their 300,000 tons, and we've looked at a cost of carbon per ton to create an internal financial incentive for reducing carbon. We've embedded operational energy use intensity and embodied carbon targets across their program of projects in their infrastructure to make sure that they're delivering and their design teams are delivering on massive carbon reduction across the entire program, so that we fit with the huge infrastructure strategic outcomes and ambitions that they have. And we're driving optioneering, both from life cycle assessments, both from life cycle costing. We're doing the OPEX versus CAPEX uplifts and return on investment, internal rate of return, paybacks. And we're providing information on a day-to-day basis throughout the program for the infrastructure, so they know how they can decarbonize overall, how they can journey towards net zero carbon. So if they have got a total impact of 300,000 tons and you set a carbon price of £100, you can quickly figure out you've got a potential to cost that program £3 million or 3 million euros. So you're creating internal incentive to drive carbon reduction. You know, that incentive could be self-imposed, it could be eventually it will be planning and government led, I'm sure. But we're doing it on a day-to-day practical basis. We are helping them drive carbon reductions with financial incentives, with targets to reduce on different parts of the program and different projects. And we're using tools to create options through lifecycle assessment and lifecycle costing. Here's just an example of that how across the infrastructure program. You know, we've got different projects in offices, baggage stands, piers, wings, transport hubs. And you can see there we've got a number of energy use intensity targets and embodied carbon targets set against an Icelandic average. So we very much have convinced them and influenced them to go down this route using business as usual numbers and helping to support what a good infrastructure program from a carbon reduction looks like. And you can see there that talking about the net zero part as opposed to just pure carbon reduction, if we did no action because of the financial incentive that we've given ourselves, it would cost the program €3 million. But if we take action, we set targets, we drive carbon reduction throughout the program, we're reducing that cost down to about 0.5% of the total program value. This is what the outcome of the work we've done is, the why, what, and how. So we know why we've done it, we know what we've done, and we know how we're going to do it across the entire program. And this is very much a document, a strategic approach that can be taken across all infrastructure to drive carbon reduction, but also to drive a wider sustainability agenda. You can see there the how. We're aiming to reduce 150,000 tons of carbon across that entire program through a variety of KPIs, targets, and optioneering in design. So just as some practical steps, what do you need to do to create a net zero carbon infrastructure? The title of this. So make sure the why is part of the business case and the governance structure of your program. Decide your what from the beginning. You know, what are you going to focus on? You know, sustainability, net zero carbon, very loaded terms, very subjective in terms of what it means and what you actually want to do by the end of your project. Make sure someone owns the outcome and the vision at the very end. You know, our vision on Keflavik is to have 150,000 tons of carbon saved. Someone needs to own that vision throughout. Someone needs to be responsible for driving it, delivering it, reporting against it, sharing success, sharing best practice against it, driving design teams, challenging, and then as a very, very last resort, offsetting and making it all about the carbon reduction as opposed to the net zero piece. But that's it from me. That was just a very small, simplified version of how we are driving net zero carbon in infrastructure.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ian. We've got plenty of questions coming in, so if I can ask everyone to turn back on their cameras and mics, we'll jump into it. Excellent. So we've had one come in to start things off, and Ian, I might put it to you in the first place as it came in while you were speaking, so I'll let you have first crack at it, but if anybody else wants to answer off the bat, please feel free to jump in. So someone said, it's great to hear all the ideas and outlines of what is required, but the question then becomes, when do we need to make a systematic change? Do we have to do it all at once, or do we need to make incremental changes between now moving forward?
Yeah, a lot of the time when we talk about incremental change, particularly on the major programs of infrastructure, is we talk about giving people the information to make decisions. And I guess that's why I chose like a project program management type approach. Is we've just been providing lifecycle costing, lifecycle assessment, carbon numbers, carbon figures, carbon saved numbers. We haven't enforced or driven a decision. We've just provided the information for the program management structure to make decisions. So by providing that information, they have what they need to be comfortable to make change and to make incremental change. So the first program or project that this is applied to, they might be comfortable with a 1% uplift to the capex for a 3-year return on investment because of the heating solution they choose. But as they become more comfortable with the information, the science, the process, that information is still there and they're more willing to make larger change. That's what we've seen is you provide clear, digestible information for the people who make decisions around carbon, in this instance, embodied or operational, and then they're comfortable with that. And as long as you've made it part of the decision-making process, things will happen also without you being there. I don't have to be in the conversation. You don't have to be in the conversation all the time. It's part of the process.
Brilliant. Maria, I saw that you had, looked like you might have had some thoughts when the question was being read out. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a very difficult question, and I totally understand Ian's views on this, that, you know, there are some requirements we need to meet. This is what the decision-making framework looks like. When it comes to being the asset owner for this, and how quickly we need to make systemic changes, my answer would be yesterday, because if you look at the urgency of action and the messages from COP26 about this being the critical decade, we need to make sure all asset owners not only have time-bound targets, meaning you need to act now and show and demonstrate how you align with the Paris Agreement, meaning you cannot call net zero something where you have reduced 20% your emissions and the rest is offset. That's not net zero Paris aligned, yeah? And how do they make the brave decisions, which at the moment our system is not designed to do that, to build on Tom's point, which is about how an asset owner, like in Ian's case, their client in aviation, could actually influence the decision on the scope 3 emissions from their airplanes, you know, which looking at the whole system. What are the things they need to be doing to influence the user carbon? These are very, very difficult decisions, and Tom very, very well illustrated that at the system level. But we cannot make that change unless there is some sort of an infrastructure integrator or there is some guidance and brave decision from government regulators. But if you're asking on when can we be doing this, I think those decisions need to happen as soon as possible to enable that environment. That's my view. Yeah.
Absolutely. Tom, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I strongly agree with everything that's been said, and the net zero target really needs to set now in place a cascade of those actions that I tried to show in the diagram of getting the system goals, the purpose, the way we define it, getting that fit for purpose, having net zero integrated explicitly into all outcomes we want to achieve. It's a quality that outcomes must have rather than a separate thing that can be traded off against other strategic criteria. So yeah, everything we do from this point forward needs to be aligned with net zero. But young assets have got a long life ahead of them. We can delay the replacement of those, but there needs to be a long-term strategy to 2050, and end of life assets is a big opportunity, but everything we do needs to be aligned with the guiding principles. We need the foundations in place.
Brilliant. Okay, I'll jump on to the next question then. And Maria, I might ask you this one in the first instance, but again, guys, please feel free to join with your thoughts. So the question came in that was policy commitments to stimulating development of innovative solutions, tech and otherwise, that are reaching early commercialization stage. But the question is, what's necessary to accelerate the uptake of these new systems? How do we overcome resistance to new improvement and reliance on what we know works?
Yeah, that's again a very, very interesting question. And I've been faced with this dilemma, not only me, everyone, I'm sure, Ian and Tom and all the clients in this space, because there are two things. One is the incentives that are driven from the government and the policy to create a market essentially and make things more cost effective. Yeah, like in the case of renewables, we've seen the drop in price in the last how many years, and we're achieving grid parity. Now, when it comes to uptaking some of the more innovative solutions, and this is a very good example on the low carbon concrete, cement-free concrete space, there are still some blockers in the forms of standards out there that are not risk-based. So we need to do more. All asset owners need to really understand, and the supply chain, of course, the designers, contractors, of what is the actual risk of adopting something new. But in order to accelerate the adoption, there has to be an appropriate risk allocation and see which party is best to take that risk. Because if you're a designer in the case of low carbon concrete, and let's say you are pushed to put a cement-free alternative in a specific environment, and you're not sure it works if you reduce your safety factor, who is going to cover your professional indemnity insurance? Are you insured for that? And then on the other side, on the asset owner side, is the asset owner appropriate to take some proportion of that risk as well, or just allocate to the supply chain? So net zero, because it will involve quite a lot of new solutions, not all of them, but a lot of them are like nature-based solutions. Nobody knows the performance yet of those. We need to be more sophisticated in understanding the risk and the level of risk, and the sooner we do it, the better we'll do it. And that's why we have to collaborate together with the supply chain, with the research institutions to make this happen faster. It's not just the government throwing some money in there. Of course, the government can act as a guarantor for new markets, like in hydrogen or like in nuclear, or for major risk projects, big infrastructure projects, act as a guarantor. We've seen that many times in different parts of the world. But this risk understanding is very, very important for everyone to have. Yeah, sorry for the long-winded answer.
No, absolutely. Ian, Tom, did either of you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I obviously completely agree with Maria. I was going to take a slightly different tact in that all new solutions, regardless of the topic, are as much about individuals and people and how we present information. And obviously there's a big technical argument and there's a big part to convince people on the technical front, but any change is difficult for anybody anywhere across all topics. And we have to be very conscious of the way we present information, how we present it, and how we get our argument across. And I think that has been a real key learning on a lot of infrastructure projects, is the technical and the cost quite often might not be any challenge, but it's the ability for individuals to change and the behavioral side, which is as much of a barrier. And I think it's just being conscious of that in any change scenario, is that it is the people part of it, which we have to be equally aware of.
Absolutely. Tom, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I mean, the value of doing all of this is societal, and the infrastructure sector doesn't necessarily capture all of that value in taking decisions that do the right thing in terms of getting towards net zero. So there's things around the funding and finance models, I think, that are very important. And we seem to expect new technology approaches, new net zero technologies, to compete on a cost basis with mature infrastructure, forgetting that mature infrastructure has lower marginal costs because it's already paid back its investment. It's been long life, it's a sunk cost. So we need to find ways of getting funding and finance in that isn't perhaps just from the power sector. It's how we get collective investments into the societal good, rather than funding all of this from the revenue gained from selling the power it produces. We need some way of recognizing the value of not having produced the greenhouse gas emissions. But I can't tell you how.
Okay, again, I'll jump to the next question just because we've got quite a few coming in and not so much time. So I'm going to try and get through as many as we can for people. Maria, this one's addressed to you. So again, I might get you to go first. But Maria, you mentioned key policy, government could go brave. What would be some key drivers for reaching net zero in infrastructure from a policy point of view?
So from what I've seen and from discussions, informal discussions with different people in government, regulators, because they're not only one person representing government, obviously there are different levels of support, I suppose, and direction of travel. The first thing I would say is that the CCC have done an excellent job in the UK to do some thorough analysis of how infrastructure and other sectors of the economy fit into the wider kind of carbon emissions in the UK. And they have been recommending the carbon budgets. Now, when I first saw the UK net zero strategy, and I know more recently we saw the energy strategy, which has more detail and more direction of travel, I would have to say on the former, for the net zero strategy, there is very little clarity of how its UK infrastructure sectors, with the exception of energy, fits into the decarbonization agenda. So what would need to happen essentially to get that level of ownership is for the government to provide a little bit more detail of how the legal obligation of 2050 net zero translated to the national carbon budget down to the individual sectors of the economy, to have specific sector targets so that the regulators of those sectors can decide at the sector level how they fit to individual asset owners. Without this, I don't think there will be a lot of accountability to really meet those targets. So I really feel there has to be a bit more clarity from an infrastructure integration point of view, top down on the targets. That would be my first reaction to this question.
Brilliant. Does anyone want to jump in there? No? Cool. If we feel like that one's answered, we'll move on to the next one. That's good to our audience. We can get through a few more of their questions. So here we go. Here's another one. Sorry, I'm just trying to pick which one. And so there's a question here around skills and whether we currently have the skills to deliver all the things that you guys have been talking about, and whether that is the appropriate skills, or whether there needs to be some serious recruitment / training done, and what that looks like. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
We can't recruit fast enough because there's not the skills. Yeah. Yeah, obviously it's exploded in the last 3 years in terms of people's perception, people's understanding, awareness, lobbying activity, you name it, legislation, global events, and it's created an explosion in drive of individuals and organizations to act, which has created a skills shortage across engineering, across sustainability, carbon, climate. And so, yeah, there needs to be a massive green skills, for want of a better word, approach. And there was an Essex Green Skills report just released today, actually, around that. If anyone's interested in reading that, they've just done a really good one. Might have been wrote by Mace. There might be a bias there, so maybe take that with a pinch of salt.
Does anyone else want to jump in as well?
I feel we've got a great skills resource. The most intuitive systems thinkers are those that haven't yet been put through much education. Children that haven't been taught to think in silos, who instinctively look across things, and we've taught them not to. And it's only when they get to university, possibly even postgraduate, that we start teaching them to start doing it over again. So there was a skills gap there, and it's entirely of our own making. So we need to, I think, primary school age, early high school age, we need to start getting systems thinking taught as an intuitive thing. And I think the technical skills might then follow, but I feel we teach people not to be systems thinkers and then reteach them. In terms of skills, that's bonkers.
Fully agree with both, actually, with both Tom and Ian. Nothing else to add.
Brilliant. I am just very conscious that we have covered a lot of ground and there's been lots of points raised. So I was wondering if I could ask each of you to sort of give the audience, like, if you wanted people to walk away from this with, 1 or 2 key points, are there, sort of key areas that you think is the most important thing for people to consider? And I don't mind who goes first, whoever wants to.
I can go first if you want. So I think if there is one thing I would say is that net zero, when we're talking about net zero decarbonization, is not just an extra thing. It's not a technical solution only. It's not just one project or a study. It's going to be an operating environment in 2050, hopefully across the globe, following the Paris Agreement. And that means every bit of economic activity we have, every other pressures we have, will have to operate in this space. So yeah, we shouldn't be looking at it as an extra thing.
Brilliant. Whoever wants to go next, feel free.
So I feel our destination has to be a donut economy, the like of which put forward by Kate Rayworth. So my thing would be, we need donut infrastructure. We need infrastructure systems capable of enabling societies that live fairly above a certain level, but don't exceed planetary bounds. And I think that could be a good guiding mindset for the way we think about infrastructure decision making and the purpose of infrastructure. So yeah, throwing an additional thing in, it's kind of the culmination of, I think, a lot of what we've been discussing, getting that mindset, getting that purpose absolutely right, and perhaps transcending the way we look at things by framing it very differently at that high level.
Brilliant. And Ian?
Yeah, mine's going to be fairly simple. It's just always to focus on the outcome, the end goal of infrastructure. If we're talking about carbon reduction, what do you want that infrastructure to achieve by the end of it? And if you know that and keep the process along the way nice and simple, then your chances of actually achieving it are going to be a lot higher. And really, that's what it's about for me, us, is achieving it, doing it, getting to the end and the outcome you're after. Otherwise, there's a huge amount of people, I say, with a skill shortage, with the people involved, everyone needs to be doing it. Everyone needs to be involved. Everyone needs to be participating. Everyone needs to be on the journey. And the best way to do that is to have it simple and outcome oriented.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's brought us to the end of the hour. It's absolutely flown by. I'd love to thank you all for your expertise and your time. Really appreciate it. The audience has been so engaged. So thank you to the audience as well. And obviously a sign that you guys have provided some really valuable information for them. Just love to thank everyone who's taken part in our Net Zero Live conference today. It's been really wonderful. This is our last session, but all 3 sessions from across the day will be available on demand via the same links. They're on all of our home pages. That's building design and housing today. So please check them out. So once again, thank you to our panel and thank you to our audience, and
Bye. Thank you very much.